Welcome to another episode of Boring History for Sleep. Tonight we'll drift across the vast Pacific Ocean, following the gentle rhythm of ancient waves as we explore one of humanity's most remarkable yet peaceful achievements. Close your eyes and imagine the soft lapping of water against a wooden hull, the steady creak of rope and timber, and the whisper of trade winds filling woven sails. Our story begins not with conquest or conflict, but with patience, observation, and an almost mystical understanding of the sea. For over 1,000 years, Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using nothing more than their senses, their knowledge, and their ability to read the language of waves. The Pacific Ocean covers 1/3 of our planet's surface. It stretches over 63 million square miles of seemingly endless blue water. To most of us, it would appear as a featureless void, an impossible maze without landmarks or signposts. But to the master navigators of Polynesia, every wave told a story. Every swell carried information. Every ripple was a whisper from distant lands. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, let us journey together across these ancient seaways, learning how generations of islanders transformed the world's largest ocean into a familiar neighborhood, one wave at a time. The gentle giants of the Pacific. Picture, if you will, the Pacific Ocean on a calm morning 3,000 years ago. The sun rises slowly over the horizon, painting the water in soft shades of gold and amber. The surface appears smooth, almost mirror-like, but this is an illusion. Beneath this tranquil exterior, the ocean pulses with a complex network of swells and currents, a highway system that early Polynesian navigators learned to read. Like a familiar book, the Pacific Ocean is not one body of water, but many. Trade winds blow steadily across its surface, creating predictable patterns of waves and currents. Deep ocean swells, born from storms thousands of miles away, roll endlessly across the basin. These swells can travel for days or weeks, carrying with them the memory of their origin, information that skilled navigators could decode to find their way home. The Polynesian peoples began their great ocean migrations around 1000 BCE, spreading eastward from Southeast Asia into the vast Pacific. They moved slowly, deliberately, island by island, generation by generation. Each journey was not a desperate escape, but a carefully planned expedition, carried out by skilled seafarers who understood that the ocean was not an obstacle to overcome, but a medium to master. Imagine a Polynesian double-hulled canoe, or vaca, resting gently on the water. These vessels were marvels of engineering, perfectly adapted to their environment. Two parallel hulls connected by a platform provided stability in rough seas while remaining light enough to be lifted by waves rather than fighting against them. The flexible design allowed the boat to bend and flex with the ocean's movement, becoming one with the water rather than battling it. The canoes were typically 50 to 100 feet long, large enough to carry entire families along with their provisions, animals, and the seeds and cuttings needed to establish new settlements. But despite their size, they moved across the water with a grace that would be envied by modern yacht designers. The secret lay not just in their construction, but in how their navigators read the subtle messages that the ocean constantly transmitted. These navigators, known as Palu in some cultures, were revered figures in Polynesian society. They underwent years of training, learning not just the practical skills of seamanship, but developing an almost supernatural sensitivity to the ocean's moods and movements. They learned to feel the difference between various types of swells, to recognize the way waves behaved when they encountered different types of islands, and to detect the presence of land long before it became visible on the horizon. The language of waves. To understand how Polynesian navigators read waves, we must first understand what waves are and how they behave. Close your eyes and imagine yourself floating gently on the surface of the deep ocean. You're not swimming or struggling, you're simply existing in perfect harmony with the water, rising and falling with its natural rhythm. Waves are energy traveling through water. When wind blows across the ocean's surface, it transfers energy to the water, creating ripples that grow into waves. But waves are not just wind-driven disturbances. They are information carriers, holding within their patterns clues about everything from weather conditions hundreds of miles away to the presence of islands below the horizon. Ocean swells are different from ordinary waves. While surface waves are created by local winds and tend to be chaotic and short-lived, swells are the deep, rhythmic undulations that travel vast distances across the ocean with little loss of energy. These swells were the highways that Polynesian navigators followed, steady and predictable patterns that could guide them across thousands of miles of open water. A trained navigator could distinguish between multiple swell systems operating simultaneously. There might be a primary swell coming from the northeast, generated by trade winds, while a secondary swell from the southeast carried the memory of a storm that passed days ago hundreds of miles away. A third, more subtle swell might indicate the presence of reflected waves, energy that had encountered an island and bounced back. The navigator would lie flat in the bottom of the canoe, placing their back against the hull to better feel these wave patterns through the boat's movement. In this position, they could detect swells that were completely invisible to the eye, feeling through their body the subtle differences in period, amplitude, and direction that revealed the ocean's secrets. Different islands created different wave patterns. A high volcanic island would block swells completely on its leeward side, creating a wave shadow that could be detected from many miles away. Low coral atolls might allow some wave energy to pass over them, but would still create subtle disruptions in the swell pattern. Rocky coasts would reflect waves cleanly, while beaches with gentle slopes would absorb wave energy, each creating its own distinctive signature. The most remarkable skill was the ability to detect T-Lapa, a phenomenon where swells reflecting off islands created interference patterns with the primary swell, resulting in areas where the water seemed to dance with phosphorescent light. These shimmering patches of water could indicate the direction to an island even when it was beyond the horizon, invisible to conventional sight. Navigators learned to recognize these patterns through years of practice. Often, beginning their training as young children, they would spend hours floating in lagoons, learning to feel the difference between waves coming from different directions. They studied the behavior of waves in different weather conditions, learning how swells changed as they traveled across deep water versus shallow reefs. The tools of navigation. While Polynesian navigation was primarily based on reading natural signs, navigators did use some tools to help them maintain their course and remember complex information. The most famous of these were the stick charts, or wapape, used by navigators in the Marshall Islands. These stick charts were not maps in the conventional sense, but rather training aids and memory devices that helped navigators visualize wave patterns around islands. Made from thin strips of bamboo or coconut palm ribs, tied together with coconut fiber, these charts showed the relationship between islands and the swell patterns that connected them. Picture one of these charts in your mind, a delicate latticework of sticks, representing the dominant swell directions, with small shells or coral pieces marking the positions of islands. The curves and angles of the sticks showed how swells bent and refracted as they encountered islands, creating the complex interference patterns that trained navigators could read. But these charts were not taken on voyages. They were teaching tools used on land to help apprentice navigators understand the theoretical patterns they would encounter at sea. Once at sea, navigators relied entirely on their senses and their memory, reading the living patterns of the ocean itself. The canoes themselves were also instruments of navigation. The flexible hull acted as a sensitive detector, transmitting the subtle movements of different swells directly to the navigator's body. The sail could be adjusted not just to catch wind, but to help the navigator feel how the boat responded to different wave conditions. Some navigators used simple devices like floating gourds or sticks dropped into the water to help visualize current directions and wave patterns. Others relied on the behavior of seabirds, the color and temperature of the water, the formation of clouds, and even the taste and smell of the sea air to gather navigational information. The most important tool, however, was the navigator's own body and mind. Through years of training, they developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to the ocean's moods. They could detect changes in water temperature by trailing their hand overboard. They could identify different types of islands by the way clouds formed above them. They could tell direction by the flight patterns of seabirds and the migration routes of marine life. Reading the ocean's memory. To truly understand Polynesian wave navigation, we must appreciate that the ocean has memory. Every storm, every island, every change in depth or current leaves its mark in the wave patterns that spread across the Pacific. Skilled navigators learned to read this memory, extracting information from wave patterns that might have originated hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Imagine you are a navigator lying in the hull of your canoe, feeling the gentle rhythm of swells passing beneath you. You notice that the primary swell is coming from the northeast, steady and regular, with a period of about 12 seconds between wave crests. This is the normal trade wind swell generated by the persistent winds that blow across this part of the Pacific. But wait, there's something else. Beneath this primary pattern, you feel a secondary swell, much more subtle, coming from the southeast. This swell has a longer period, perhaps 15 seconds, and a different quality to its movement. Your trained senses tell you that this swell originated from a large storm system that passed far to the south several days ago. The waves have traveled hundreds of miles, but they still carry the memory of their violent birth. As you continue to feel the boat's movement, you detect something even more subtle, a slight choppiness in the water that seems to come from due east. This is puzzling at first because there's no weather system in that direction that should be generating waves. But then you realize what you're feeling. This is reflected swell, wave energy that has encountered an island to the east and bounced back toward you. The presence of this reflected swell tells you several things. First, there is indeed an island in that direction, even though you cannot see it. Second, based on the strength and clarity of the reflection, you can estimate roughly how far away the island is, perhaps 50 or 60 miles. Third, the quality of the reflection tells you something about the nature of the island's coast. A clean, strong reflection suggests steep cliffs or rocky shores, while a diffused reflection might indicate beaches or coral reefs. But the ocean's memory extends even deeper. Polynesian navigators learned to recognize the subtle ways that islands modified wave patterns even when the waves had traveled far beyond the islands themselves. A swell that had passed close to a high island would carry a slightly different energy signature than one that had traveled only over deep water. Waves that had crossed over shallow reefs would have a different period and amplitude than those that had encountered only deep ocean. These modifications were incredibly subtle, often undetectable to anyone but the most highly trained navigators. But for those with the skill to read them, they provided a constant stream of information about the geography of the ocean, allowing navigators to track their position relative to known islands even when those islands were far beyond the horizon. The most skilled navigators could create mental maps of vast areas of ocean, based entirely on wave patterns. They knew, for example, that in a particular region, the primary swell would come from the northeast during certain seasons, modified by reflections from 3 different island groups. They knew where to expect wave shadows from high islands, and where the interference between different swell systems would create the telltale patterns that mark traditional sea routes. The dance of wind and wave. The relationship between wind and waves was fundamental to Polynesian navigation, but understanding this relationship required a deep appreciation for the complexity of atmospheric and oceanic systems across the Pacific. The winds that shaped these ancient voyages were not random gusts, but part of vast, predictable patterns that navigators learned to read like a seasonal calendar. The trade winds were the backbone of Pacific navigation. These steady winds, blowing from northeast to southwest in the northern Pacific and from southeast to northwest in the southern Pacific, created the consistent wave patterns that navigators could rely upon. But the trade winds were not constant. They had their own rhythms and seasons, strengthening and weakening in predictable cycles that experienced navigators knew by heart. During certain times of the year, the trade winds would weaken or even reverse, replaced by different wind systems that created entirely different wave patterns. Navigators had to understand not just the normal conditions but all the variations and exceptions that might occur during a long voyage. Picture yourself on a canoe during the season when the trades were weakening. The steady northeast swell that had been your companion for days begins to diminish, becoming confused and chaotic as new wind systems establish themselves. To an inexperienced sailor, this might seem like a navigational nightmare, but to a skilled Polynesian navigator, it was simply another chapter in the ocean's story. As the old swell system faded, the navigator would begin to detect new patterns emerging. Perhaps a southwest wind would begin to blow, creating its own wave system. These new waves would initially be small and choppy, but as the wind continued, they would organize themselves into a new swell pattern that the navigator could follow. The transition periods between different wind systems were actually some of the most informative times for navigation. During these periods, multiple wave systems might coexist, creating complex interference patterns that revealed information about the surrounding geography. An experienced navigator could read these patterns like a detailed map, identifying the direction to various islands based on how different swell systems interacted. Local wind systems added another layer of complexity to wave reading. Islands created their own microclimates with unique wind patterns that generated distinctive wave signatures. A large volcanic island might create its own daily wind cycle, with air rising from the heated land during the day and flowing back toward the ocean at night. These local winds would create their own wave patterns, different from the larger trade wind swells. Navigators learned to recognize these local patterns and use them as signs of approaching land. Changes in wind direction, alterations in wave period and amplitude, and the development of confused seas all indicated that the deep ocean environment was being modified by the presence of land, even when that land was still below the horizon. The most subtle wind and wave interactions occurred around groups of islands, where multiple land masses created complex patterns of wind shadows, accelerated flows, and reflected waves. Navigators who knew these waters intimately could navigate through island groups using only these patterns, never needing to see the islands themselves. Stories written in water. Every voyage across the Pacific was a story written in water, a narrative told through the language of waves that only trained navigators could read. These stories were not just about navigation, they were about understanding the ocean as a living, breathing entity with its own moods, memories, and messages. Consider the story of Kailani, a master navigator from Tahiti who lived perhaps 800 years ago. Her name, meaning ocean sky, reflected her deep connection to both the sea and the celestial patterns that complemented wave. Navigation. Kailani was planning a voyage to establish a new settlement on an island group several hundred miles to the north, a journey that would take her canoe and its passengers across open ocean for perhaps 10 days. Before departing, Kailani spent weeks preparing, not just her canoe and supplies, but her mind and senses. She meditated in the shallows of her home lagoon, practicing her ability to distinguish between different types of wave motion. She studied the seasonal patterns of wind and swell, timing her departure to take advantage of favorable conditions. On the morning of departure, Kailani guided her double-hulled canoe through the reef passage and into the deep blue waters of the open Pacific. Immediately, she began reading the story that the waves would tell her. The primary swell was coming from the northeast, steady and strong, the normal trade wind pattern for this season. But she also detected a secondary swell from the east, the signature of a distant storm system that had passed several days before. As the canoe sailed north, Kailani monitored these wave patterns constantly. She knew that after 2 days of sailing, she should begin to detect the wave shadow of a small atoll that lay to the northwest of her route. This island would not be visible, but its presence would be revealed by a subtle reduction in the northeast swell. On the second evening, as predicted, Kailani felt the wave patterns change. The northeast swell became slightly confused, losing some of its regular rhythm. This told her that she was approaching the wave shadow of the atoll, confirming her position and course. Though she never saw the island, its invisible presence guided her navigation. By the fourth day, new patterns began to emerge. Kailani detected reflected waves coming from the northwest, energy from the northeast swell that had encountered her destination islands and bounced back. These reflected waves were still faint, but their presence told her that she was on the right course and that her destination was perhaps 2 days sailing ahead. As she drew closer to her destination, the wave patterns became increasingly complex. Multiple islands in the target group created multiple reflection patterns, each with its own signature. Kailani could distinguish between the sharp reflections from high volcanic islands and the diffused patterns from low coral atolls. She could tell which islands had deep water approaches and which were surrounded by shallow reefs. On the morning of the 7th day, the wave story reached its climax. The water around the canoe had become a complex dance of intersecting swells, reflections, and local disturbances. To an untrained observer, it might have seemed chaotic, but to Kailani it was as clear as a detailed chart. She could feel the presence of land in multiple directions, could sense the deep channels between islands and the shallow areas to avoid. As the sun climbed higher, the first island appeared on the horizon, exactly where the waves had told her it would be, but Kailani had known of its presence for hours before it became visible, guided by the patient story that the ocean had been telling her throughout her journey. The living ocean. To Polynesian navigators, the ocean was not an empty void to be crossed, but a living entity teeming with information and life. Every creature, every change in water color or temperature, every shift in the wind carried messages that could guide a skilled navigator home. Wave reading was just one part of a holistic approach to navigation that treated the entire marine environment as a source of directional information. Imagine yourself lying in the bottom of a traditional canoe, feeling the gentle motion of deep ocean swells beneath you. The sun is warm on your face, and the steady whisper of wind in the woven pandanus sail creates a peaceful rhythm that matches the boat's movement through the water. But even in this tranquil moment, you are gathering information. The color of the water tells you about depth and bottom composition. Deep ocean. Water is a profound blue, almost purple in its intensity, while shallower water takes on greener hues. Water that has passed over coral reefs carries tiny particles that give it a distinctive clarity and color that trained navigators could recognize from miles away. The temperature of the water, felt by trailing a hand overboard, reveals information about currents and depth. Water that has welled up from the deep ocean is noticeably cooler than surface water that has been warmed by the sun. Different islands create different thermal signatures as currents flow around them, and these temperature changes could be detected long before the islands themselves became visible. Seabirds were perhaps the most reliable indicators of land. Different species had different flight ranges and behaviors that navigators learned to interpret. Frigate birds, with their distinctive angular wings and piratical habits, rarely flew more than 100 miles from land. Their presence indicated that shores were within reach, while their flight directions often pointed toward the nearest islands. Boobies and other diving seabirds followed schools of fish, and their behavior could indicate not just the presence of land, but the location of fishing grounds and favorable currents. Navigators learned to read the subtle differences in bird behavior, the difference between birds heading out to sea in the morning to fish, and birds returning to land in the evening to roost. Even more subtle were the signs carried by the wind itself. Air that had passed over land carried different scents and temperatures than air that had traveled only over open ocean. Navigators could smell the distinctive aroma of vegetation, detect the humidity that indicated rain showers over distant islands, or notice the slight temperature changes that revealed the presence of large land masses. Cloud formations provided another layer of information. Islands created their own weather patterns, with clouds forming predictably over land as the sun heated the ground and caused air to rise. The shape, color, and behavior of these clouds could indicate not just the presence of land, but the type and size of islands below them. High volcanic islands created towering cumulus clouds that could be seen from many miles away. Low coral atolls produced more subtle cloud patterns, often just a slight brightening of the sky caused by sunlight reflecting off white coral. Beaches. Navigators learned to distinguish between these different cloud signatures, reading the sky like an aerial map of the ocean. The ocean itself was alive with creatures whose behavior provided navigational clues. Certain species of dolphins were known to follow specific currents or frequent particular types of water. Whales migrated along predictable routes that navigators could use as guidelines. Even schools of fish had their patterns and preferences that could indicate position and proximity to land. Phosphorescence in the water, the ghostly glow created by microscopic organisms when disturbed, had its own patterns and meanings. Some types of phosphorescent displays indicated particular water conditions or the presence of certain currents. The famous T. Lapa phenomenon, where reflected waves created dancing lights in the water, was just one example of how bioluminescence could provide navigational information. The Great Journeys. The techniques of wave navigation enabled some of the most remarkable journeys in human history, voyages across thousands of miles of open ocean to discover and settle islands scattered across the vast Pacific. These were not desperate flights or accidental discoveries, but carefully planned expeditions, carried out by master navigators who treated the ocean as a familiar highway. Consider the Great Journey from the Marquesas Islands to Hawaii, a voyage of over 2,000 miles across the northern Pacific. This journey, undertaken perhaps 1,500 years ago, required navigators to maintain their course across weeks of open ocean sailing, with no landmarks to guide them except the patterns of waves, winds, and stars. The navigators who planned this journey would have known that they were sailing into unknown waters, but they were not sailing blind. They understood the seasonal patterns of winds and currents in the region. They knew that certain types of swell patterns indicated deep ocean conditions, while others suggested the presence of shallow areas or distant land. As their great double-hulled canoes pushed north from the Marquesas, the navigators would have felt the familiar northeast trade wind swell beneath their hulls. This swell would be their primary guide for much of the journey, a steady rhythm that would carry them toward their distant destination. But the journey was not simply a matter of following one swell system. As the canoes sailed north, they would encounter different wind systems and wave patterns. The navigators had to understand how these patterns changed with latitude and season, adjusting their course to account for the shifting conditions they encountered. Days passed, then weeks. The canoes sailed through areas where multiple swell systems intersected, creating complex wave patterns that required expert interpretation. The navigators read these patterns constantly, using them to confirm their position and course even when no land was visible in any direction. The first signs of their destination came not from sight, but from the waves themselves. Perhaps 200 miles south of the Hawaiian Islands, the navigators would have begun to detect subtle changes in the wave patterns, the first hints of reflected swells from the high volcanic peaks that lay ahead. As they drew closer, these reflected waves became stronger and more distinct. The navigators could tell that they were approaching high islands, and they could estimate roughly how far away these islands were based on the strength of the wave reflections. They could even begin to distinguish between different islands in the chain based on the different reflection patterns each created. When the peaks of the Hawaiian Islands finally appeared on the horizon, they emerged exactly where the wave patterns had predicted they would be. The navigators had successfully completed one of the longest open ocean voyages in human history, guided primarily by their ability to read the language of waves. This pattern was repeated across the Pacific as Polynesian navigators discovered and settled islands from Easter Island in the east to New Zealand in the southwest. Each journey required the same skills: the ability to read wave patterns, understand weather systems, and interpret the subtle signs that revealed the presence of land beyond the horizon. As they drew closer, these reflected waves became stronger and more distinct. The navigators could tell that they were approaching high islands, and they could estimate roughly how far away these islands were based on the strength of the wave reflections. They could even begin to distinguish between different islands in the chain based on the different reflection patterns each created. When the peaks of the Hawaiian Islands finally appeared on the horizon, they emerged exactly where the wave patterns had predicted they would be. The navigators had successfully completed one of the longest open ocean voyages in human history, guided primarily by their ability to read the language of waves. This pattern was repeated across the Pacific as Polynesian navigators discovered and settled islands from Easter Island in the east to New Zealand in the southwest. Each journey required the same skills: the ability to read wave patterns, understand weather systems, and interpret the subtle signs that revealed the presence of land beyond the horizon. The art of memory. Central to Polynesian navigation was an extraordinary tradition of memorization and oral knowledge transmission. Since these navigators used no written charts or instruments, everything they knew about wave patterns, weather systems, and ocean routes had to be stored in memory and passed down through generations of teachers and students. The training of a navigator began in childhood and could take decades to complete. Young apprentices learned not just the practical skills of sailing and seamanship, but developed the extraordinary sensory abilities and memory skills that navigation required. They learned to feel the difference between waves with subtle differences in period, amplitude, and direction. They memorized vast catalogs of information about wind patterns, current systems, and the wave signatures of hundreds of different islands. This knowledge was transmitted through songs, stories, and chants that encoded navigational information in memorable forms. A single song might contain detailed information about the wave patterns around a particular island group, the seasonal variations in wind and current, and the landmarks and signs that would guide a navigator safely to his destination. Consider a traditional navigation chant from the Caroline Islands that describes the wave patterns around a particular atoll. The chant begins with references to the normal trade wind swell, describing its direction, period, and seasonal variations. It then details the way this primary swell is modified as it encounters the island, creating reflected waves and wave shadows that can be detected from various distances. The chant continues with descriptions of secondary swell systems, waves generated by distant storms or seasonal wind changes that create additional navigation references. It describes the interference patterns created when these different swell systems interact and explains how to interpret these patterns to determine position and course. But the chant is more than just a catalog of technical information. It's woven together with references to traditional stories, mythological figures, and cultural landmarks that help navigators remember the complex details. The wave patterns are associated with the movements of legendary heroes, the seasonal activities of sea creatures, or the recurring themes of traditional tales. This integration of practical and cultural knowledge made the information easier to remember and more meaningful to the navigators who used it. A navigator didn't just memorize that a particular island created a certain type of wave reflection. He remembered the story of how the culture hero Maui's fishing hook caught the island and pulled it up from the depths, creating the distinctive underwater topography that generated those particular wave patterns. The oral tradition also allowed for the continuous refinement and updating of navigational knowledge. As navigators gained new experience or discovered new information, they could modify the traditional chants and stories to incorporate their findings. This kept the knowledge alive and current, ensuring that each generation of navigators had access to the most accurate and complete information available. The memorization techniques themselves were sophisticated and extensive. Navigators learned to associate different types of information with different sensory memories. They might associate the wave patterns around one island with a particular sound or smell, making it easier to recall the correct information when actually navigating in that area. Some navigators developed personal memory systems that linked navigational information to the layout of familiar places on their home islands. They might associate the wave patterns of different sea routes with the paths between villages on their home island, or link current systems to the flow of fresh water streams they knew from childhood. The decline and revival. The ancient art of Polynesian wave navigation began to decline with the arrival of European explorers and the introduction of Western navigation techniques. Compass-based navigation seemed more reliable and easier to learn than the complex traditional methods that required years of training and extraordinary sensory skills. As European colonial influence spread across the Pacific in the 18th and 19th centuries, traditional navigation knowledge was gradually abandoned. Young Polynesians were encouraged to learn Western ways, and the old masters who held the traditional knowledge passed away without fully transmitting their skills to the next generation. By the mid-20th century, traditional Pacific navigation was nearly extinct. Only a few elderly navigators in remote island communities still retained the complete knowledge of their ancestors, the complex understanding of wave patterns, weather systems, and ocean signs that had enabled the greatest maritime achievements in human history was in danger of being lost forever. But in the 1960s and 1970s, a remarkable revival began. Pacific Islanders, inspired by growing cultural awareness and pride in their heritage, began seeking out the remaining traditional navigators and working to preserve and revive their knowledge. This revival was led by figures like Nainoa Thompson in Hawaii and the Polynesian Voyaging Society, which was founded to preserve and practice traditional navigation techniques. The revival began with the construction of traditional voyaging canoes using ancient techniques and materials. The most famous of these was the Archaeo-Engine, double-hulled voyaging canoe built in Hawaii in 1975. This canoe was designed to test whether traditional navigation techniques could still be used for long-distance ocean voyaging. The first major test came in 1976, when Archaeo-Engine sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti, a journey of over 2,000 miles using only traditional navigation techniques. The navigator for this voyage was Pius Mau Pielug, one of the last master navigators from the Caroline Islands who still retained the complete traditional knowledge. Mau guided Archaeo-Engine across the Pacific using the same techniques his ancestors had used for centuries. He read wave patterns to determine the canoe's position and course. He used the stars for directional guidance and the behavior of sea, birds, clouds, and marine life to detect the presence of land beyond the horizon. The successful completion of this voyage proved that traditional navigation techniques were still viable and accurate. More importantly, it demonstrated that this ancient knowledge could be transmitted to new generations of navigators. Nainoa Thompson, who sailed with Mau on this voyage, became the first native Hawaiian in modern times to master traditional navigation techniques. This success sparked a broader revival of traditional navigation throughout the Pacific. Navigation schools were established in various island communities, where elderly masters began teaching their knowledge to younger students. Traditional voyaging canoes were built in many Pacific communities, and long-distance voyages using traditional techniques became regular events. The revival has revealed the remarkable sophistication of traditional Polynesian navigation techniques. Scientific studies of traditional wave-reading methods have confirmed their accuracy and shown that skilled navigators can indeed detect the subtle wave patterns and interference effects that their ancestors described. Modern navigators using traditional techniques have successfully completed voyages of thousands of miles, navigating with the same precision that their ancestors achieved centuries ago. These voyages have not only preserved traditional knowledge but have also provided new insights into the capabilities and achievements of ancient Pacific navigators. Waves of memory. As our journey across the ancient seaways of Polynesia draws toward its close, we find ourselves surrounded by the gentle memory of waves, not just the physical waves that carried our ancestors across the Pacific, but the waves of cultural memory that have preserved this remarkable knowledge through centuries of change and challenge. The art of reading ocean waves represents something profound about human adaptability and intelligence. In an environment that might seem hostile or impossibly challenging, thousands of miles of open ocean with no visible landmarks, Polynesian navigators found patterns, meaning, and highway systems that enabled them to traverse the largest body of water on Earth with confidence and precision. Their achievement was not just technical but philosophical. They learned to see the ocean not as an obstacle to overcome, but as a medium to understand. They developed a relationship with the sea that was based on respect, observation, and harmony rather than conquest and domination. Their navigation techniques required them to become part of the ocean system, to feel its rhythms in their bodies and read its moods with their senses. The wave patterns that guided these ancient voyages continue to pulse across the Pacific today, unchanged by the centuries that have passed since the Great Migrations. The same swells that carried the first settlers to Hawaii still roll across the northern Pacific. The same reflected waves that revealed the presence of islands to ancient navigators still dance in the waters around Pacific archipelagos. But now these wave patterns carry additional meaning. They are the physical embodiment of cultural memory, connecting modern Pacific Islanders to their navigating ancestors. When contemporary traditional navigators lie in the hulls of their voyaging canoes and feel the familiar rhythm of trade wind swells, they are experiencing the same sensations that guided their ancestors across these waters. Centuries ago, the revival of traditional navigation has shown that this knowledge is not just historically important, it remains practically valuable today. In an age of GPS and satellite navigation, traditional wave-reading techniques offer insights that modern instruments cannot provide. They reveal subtle environmental patterns and changes that electronic systems might miss. They connect navigators to their environment in ways that create deeper understanding and greater safety. Perhaps most importantly, traditional navigation techniques preserve a way of seeing and thinking about the natural world that offers valuable perspectives for contemporary challenges. In an era when human activities are changing global climate and ocean systems, the Polynesian understanding of natural patterns and cycles provides important insights about sustainability and adaptation. The master navigators who preserved this knowledge through the 20th century carried more than just technical information. They carried a worldview that sees humans as part of natural systems rather than separate from them. They understood that successful navigation required not just skill and knowledge, but respect for the power and complexity of natural forces. As we drift toward sleep on these gentle waves of memory, we can appreciate the remarkable achievement of the Polynesian navigators and the gift they have given to all humanity. They showed that even the vastest and most challenging environments can be understood and traversed through patient observation, accumulated wisdom, and respectful engagement with natural systems. The eternal wave. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the trade winds calm to a whisper and the ocean surface becomes a mirror reflecting the last stars, the ancient patterns of Pacific navigation seem most clear and peaceful. This is the hour when traditional navigators would often make their most important observations, when the subtle signs and patterns that guide long-distance voyaging stand out most clearly. Against the calm background of the sleeping sea, imagine yourself in these tranquil moments, lying in the gentle embrace of a traditional voyaging canoe as it rides the long, slow swells of the deep Pacific. The boat rises and falls with the rhythm of waves that began their journey thousands of miles away, carrying within their motion the memory of distant storms and the gentle persistence of trade winds that have blown across these waters for millennia. In this peaceful setting, the wisdom of Polynesian navigation reveals itself not as a collection of technical tricks or survival skills, but as a profound understanding of natural harmony. The navigators who developed these techniques understood that successful ocean voyaging required becoming part of the ocean system rather than fighting against it. They learned to read the subtle languages that the sea speaks, the whispered messages carried by waves, winds, currents, and the countless forms of life that make the ocean their home. The wave patterns that guided their voyages continue their eternal dance across the Pacific, unchanged by the passage of centuries. The same swells that carried the first Polynesian settlers to remote islands still roll across the ocean basins with the same steady rhythm, the same interference patterns that revealed the presence of islands to ancient navigators still shimmer in the waters around Pacific archipelagos, waiting for eyes trained to see their meaning. These eternal waves carry more than just energy across the ocean. They carry the cultural DNA of one of humanity's greatest achievements. Each swell holds within its motion the accumulated wisdom of generations of navigators who learned to read the ocean's moods and messages. Each reflected wave pattern embodies the patient observation and accumulated knowledge that enabled humans to discover and settle islands scattered across 1/3 of the Earth's surface. The traditional knowledge preserved by contemporary navigation revival movements ensures that this wisdom will not be lost to future generations. Young navigators learning traditional techniques today are connecting with an unbroken chain of knowledge that stretches back over 1,000 years. They are learning not just how to navigate by reading waves, but how to see the natural world as a source of information, guidance, and wisdom. As modern global civilization faces challenges that require new ways of understanding and interacting with natural systems, the Polynesian navigation tradition offers valuable insights. The patient observation, accumulated knowledge, and respectful engagement with natural forces that enabled ancient Pacific voyaging provide models for contemporary approaches to environmental challenges. The wave-reading techniques that guided ancient navigators demonstrate that humans can develop extraordinary sensitivity to natural patterns when they approach the environment with respect, patience, and careful attention. The traditional navigators who preserved this knowledge through generations of cultural change show that valuable wisdom can survive even when it seems to be overwhelmed by technological alternatives. In the end, the story of Polynesian wave navigation is a story about human potential, about our capacity to understand and work with natural systems rather than simply trying to dominate them. It's a story about the value of patient observation, accumulated wisdom, and cultural knowledge that takes generations to develop and perfect. As you drift towards sleep, carried by the gentle rhythm of these eternal waves, you can appreciate the remarkable achievement of the Pacific navigators and the peaceful wisdom their traditions offer to our modern world. Their techniques for reading ocean waves represent not just navigational skills, but a way of seeing and understanding the natural world that remains valuable and relevant today. The waves that carried their ancestors across the Pacific continue their ancient journey, carrying within their motion the memory of one of humanity's greatest achievements and the promise that this wisdom will continue to guide future generations across whatever oceans they may need to cross. In this peaceful understanding, as the last stars fade into the gentle light of dawn, we can rest in the knowledge that the eternal waves will continue their dance, carrying the wisdom of the ages across the vast blue expanse of the Pacific, forever connecting islands of knowledge across the ocean of human experience. And so ends our gentle journey across the ancient seaways of Polynesia, following the patient rhythm of waves that have carried both navigators and knowledge across the Pacific for over 1,000 years. As you settle into peaceful sleep, let the steady pulse of these ancient swells carry you toward rest, knowing that somewhere on the vast Pacific, these same wave patterns continue their eternal dance, preserving in their motion the wisdom of one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. The waves that guided our ancestors across the world's largest ocean still whisper their ancient messages to those who know how to listen. In their gentle rhythm, we find not just the techniques of navigation, but the deeper wisdom of living in harmony with the natural world. Sleep well, carried by these peaceful waves of memory and time,